Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 130 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. All witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of our meeting. Now, I'd like to remind both members and the witnesses as well that you please do wait until I recognize you by name before you speak. Now, we will now resume our study of Bill C-353, Foreign Hostage Takers Accountability Act. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-353, the Foreign Hostage Takers Accountability Act. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome the witnesses we have with us today. First, we have here as individuals, we have former Ambassador Robert Fowler, we have former Ambassador Sabine Nolk, we have from Hostage International, the Chief Executive Officer, Lara Simmons, who's joining us virtually. We have the co-founder and president of Human Rights Action Group, Sarah Teich, with us. From the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, we have the national coordinator, Mr. Tim McSorley. And finally, but certainly not last but not least, we have the Chief Executive Officer and Director from Secure Canada, which would be Ms. Cheryl Saperia and Mr. Harris Rafiq. So each of you will be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will go to the next member. I would just ask that everyone do look over every once in a while. When you see this held up, that means it really needs to be wrapped up in about 20 seconds or so. That doesn't only apply to your opening remarks. It also applies when members are asking you questions, because each member is allotted a specific time. So all of that having been explained, we will start off with Ambassador Fowler. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and through you, may I offer my thanks to Monsieur Bergeron for inviting me to offer views on the bill before you. I would also like to thank those who have taken the time and made the effort to put forward such a bill, in particular Ms. Lansman, for sponsoring and defending its purposes so eloquently. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support any and all measures aimed at providing the managers of complex international hostage crises with additional tools and greater room to maneuver. There is a vigorous debate, only some of it in public, about whether governments should even negotiate, let alone make any kind of a deal with hostage takers, or more specifically, pay ransoms or exchange prisoners to free their citizens, as the Americans did only yesterday. This dilemma is particularly acute when the victims are those who have been sent into harm's way by those same governments or international organizations acting on behalf of their member states. There tends also to be significant differences between what governments do and what they say, and that's exactly as it should be. Every time a principled position is invoked, there are exceptions. Many countries adopt what are more or less admittedly pragmatic approaches, while others proclaim immutable doctrine. But I know for certain that everybody, every country, has blinked at one time or another. A degree of flexibility and innovation, along with a measure of humility, are essential ingredients to any successful outcome, and this bill offers negotiators more flexibility and more opportunity for innovation. When doctrinaire and vainglorious posturing replace effective and nuanced diplomacy, people die. On 3 November 2015, the jihadis of Abu Sayyaf posted to Twitter a video in which they threatened to murder John Ridsdale and fellow Canadian Robert Hall, along with their companions in captivity, Marites Floor and Norwegian Kjartan Segenstad. The fact that both Messrs. Hall and Ridsdale were subsequently brutally murdered and their families forced to endure the worldwide distribution of videos of their beheadings is a brutal catastrophe and a source of significant distress to me and my family, as we all thought for months that that would be my fate. For the Ridsdale and Hall families, the nightmares will never end. Such a horrific outcome was, in my view, the result of our government's dogged intransigence, lack of imagination, and utter ignorance of how these dramas are actually played out in the real world. Mr. Chairman, it would seem to me that measures focused on bending the will of states to our purposes would principally apply to smaller, poorer, weaker states. Such measures are less likely to be effective against a major power such as China. Our government had all the tools it needed to win the release of the two Michaels at almost any point, which only makes their ordeal the more upsetting. I'm not here, though, to litigate that fraught affair, and must state that I'm terribly glad they're all finally safe. I do know well, though, that grand declarations, whether or not they're widely endorsed, of what is right and good and how the world ought to be managed, particularly those that insist how very good we are unlikely to change international behavior, move the hearts of terrorists anywhere, or alter the behavior of states detaining our nationals. We Canadians do take ourselves awfully seriously. We tend to believe that what we do and how we do it will have a great impact on what others do, and in the main, this is simply not so. The countries of the world will not be moved to different behavior by moral preaching from Canada, and Canadians around the world will be made no safer. I have spent much of my life promoting, defending, and trying to advance a rules-based international order, but I have always understood full well, although sometimes with ill grace, that those rules would regularly and inevitably be bent and often broken, most often by the most powerful, including our friends. And lest we forget, we are not powerful. Looking back 16 years, the issue that causes me visceral anger is the lack of trust, courtesy, even basic respect on the part of too many of those charged with dealing with our families. That is, Louis Gay and my family. This attitude, in our family's view, too often threaten, however unreasonably, to overshadow the hard, innovative work done by so many others to win our freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fowler. We next go to Ms. Simmons from Hostage International, who's joining us virtually. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for inviting me to provide evidence today. My comments on Bill C-353 will be based on my more than 25 years' experience working in the field of hostage-taking and arbitrary detention. Prior to joining Hostage International, I spent 18 years in private sector crisis response and was privy to the confidential details of more than 1,000 cases of hostage-taking and state detentions. At Hostage International, our support is provided to families affected by both incidents, as well as to former captives. We provide information, guidance, practical support, and access to tailored mental health therapy, legal and media advice. We have supported and continue to support Canadians affected by these incidents. Given the focus of our charity's work, I applaud legislation which seeks to assist Canadians affected by hostage-taking and arbitrary detention. But while I commend the spirit behind Bill 353, I have serious concerns about its focus and assumptions. The bill addresses 3 different types of case perpetrated by different actors without recognizing that each has to be resolved through different means and with a different level of government involvement. Criminal hostage taking is generally resolved by the hostage's family or employers paying a ransom. In terrorist kidnaps, ransoms are illegal, so negotiation options are limited, and release may require mediation by other state or non-state actors. In arbitrary detention, the Canadian government has both a consular and diplomatic role, which are key to safeguarding the well-being and release of its citizens. Bill C-353 does not recognise these distinctions, but focuses on two potential tools for assisting in bringing Canadians home: sanctions and incentivising third-party cooperation. The selection of these two mechanisms is bizarre because neither has been shown to be effective in bringing about the release of hostages or detainees. In criminal hostage taking, the identities of the perpetrator prior to any arrest are rarely, if ever, known, so it would be impossible to place sanctions on them. In a terrorist kidnap, the Canadian government already has the ability to sanction terrorist groups and individuals, but doing so in a more targeted way would more likely provoke the hostage takers into exacting revenge. Terrorists have no fear of killing hostages, as Robert Fowler just indicated. The murders of Robert Hall and John Risdale remain in our memories. Sanctions are more relevant to arbitrary detentions, though again, this is a mechanism already available to the Canadian government, and I am not aware of any detainee released to date because of sanctions. It is arguable that some nationals have been detained in response to sanctions. Where third-party incentives are concerned, there is again a real difference between hostage-taking and arbitrary detentions. Third-party information is irrelevant in arbitrary detentions, which are resolved through diplomacy between governments. In hostage-taking, on the other hand, third-party individuals can and sometimes do provide information and even assistance. But it is hard to fathom what information and cooperation would help to bring about a hostage's safe release. Even if a third party provides the hostage's exact location, it would be hugely risky to carry out a rescue operation in foreign territory, which could lead to the hostage's death. And while information about the perpetrators might help identify them, that is only relevant to seeking justice in the aftermath of an incident, not to bringing about the hostage's release. The unreliability of third-party information in hostage-taking is notorious, and incentivizing it could lead to confusion and resource diversion that only serves to increase the risks to the hostage. Finally, Hostage International applauds measures for consistent and reliable information for families. We witness firsthand the suffering of families and the frustration they often feel with their government's sharing of information. This is not limited to Canadian families. In every country we support in, families have similar grievances. But this is often because expectations of what governments know or can do in a kidnap case and what they can safely share in an arbitrary detention case are unrealistic. What is important is how governments communicate with, involve, and support families. The Canadian government has faced harsh criticism from families in the past, but the significant improvements have been made in recent years with much better feedback and a commitment to taking lessons learned. The appointment of a senior officer for hostage affairs is an important step in government accountability. The bill's focus on mental health support for families is positive, but Canada is already well ahead of its Five Eyes partners in having a victims fund that covers the cost of therapy for families. And the government is working consistently with its civil society partners, like Hostage International, to ensure families access broader and longer-term support. As for Clause 20C in the bill, around facilitating communications, this is at best ambiguous and at worst highly risky. Communications are already assisted by the RCMP between families and criminal kidnaps, and consular posts already try to access families, detainees in prison on behalf of families. These are all.
Wrap up in the next 15 seconds?
Yes.
Because we have other witnesses as well.
So no legislation is required, but if there are other types of communications intended, I would be quite concerned. There's still work to do for better family support, but the proposed legislation does not address what is needed. Thank you, Chairman.
And you'll have the opportunity to answer questions, so hopefully the remainder of your testimony will emerge during those questions. We next go to the co-founder and president of Human Rights Action Group. We're grateful to have with us today, Ms. Sarah Teach. 5 minutes, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. My name is Sarah Teach, and I'm a lawyer based in Toronto. Together with David Matus, I co-founded Human Rights Action Group, which is a collective of lawyers working directly with community groups to combat mass atrocity crimes and gross human rights violations. Most relevant to the study, though, is that 3 years ago, I authored a legislative proposal on the subject of hostage taking, which was co-published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Canadian Coalition Against Terror. That latter organization is now known as Secure Canada. Over the last year, we have worked closely with MP Landsman to adapt that legislative proposal into Bill C-353. I was originally planning at this point on summarizing each part of the bill, but I think instead I'm going to use my remaining minutes to preemptively answer a question that I think is important, and that is whether or not this bill expands consular services to individuals who are not Canadian citizens, and whether or not that is advisable or feasible. I think we have to start by looking at what services exactly may be captured by this bill, because what this bill does not do is mandate that foreign affairs provide consular services writ large to permanent residents and to those refugees who meet the definition of eligible protected person in the bill. The bill is narrowly tailored to hostage taking and arbitrary detentions and state-to-state relations. So if this bill becomes law, this is what it would do. It would enable the imposition of sanctions on perpetrators in response to cases of hostage taking and arbitrary detention, where the victim is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident or eligible protected person. It would mandate that the government provide or direct families to support, including psychological support services, again, where the victim is a citizen, permanent resident, or eligible protected person. And finally, it provides for the provision of monetary rewards and or resettlement for those who assist in the repatriation of a hostage, again, where the victim is a citizen, permanent resident, or eligible protected person. So none of this is a significant expansion of consular services for which I understand resources may be limited. The relevant metric here should be how many permanent residents and eligible protected persons are taken hostage or arbitrarily detained in state-to-state relations abroad. I don't have the figure offhand, but it seems a safe assumption that this figure is not in the millions. This figure is unlikely to be even in the hundreds. It is also relevant to note that the United States Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, which similarly enables the imposition of sanctions and mandates various supports for family members, uses the term United States national throughout the act, which is defined as including U.S. permanent residents. So this feature of the bill is not without precedent. So I hope that this helps clarify this aspect of the bill. I would also like to share that the Australian Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, which just released their report in the last few hours, agreed that it is important to legislate on this topic. They concluded, after hearing in committee from Ms. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who I understand has submitted written testimony, myself and others, that, and I'll just read a quote, "The committee is also of the view that a robust framework would in itself act as a deterrence factor against Australian citizens being wrongfully detained in the first instance. It considers that a clear and transparent framework would send a strong message to those states that choose to engage in hostage diplomacy, and that Australia will not stand for it." And that's from paragraph 3.115 on page 42 of the report. Significantly, they also recommended that the U.S. Levinson Act, which, as I noted, contains many of the same features as Bill C-353, quote, "provides a suitable starting point for establishing an Australian framework," end quote. And that's from paragraph 3.119 on page 43. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Teach. We next go to the National Coordinator for the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and that would be Mr. Tim McSorley, who's also joining us virtually. Mr. McSorley, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for this invitation to speak to Bill C-353. I'm here on behalf of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, a coalition of 44 Canadian civil society organizations, which works to defend civil liberties in the context of national security and anti-terrorism measures. Through our work, we are acutely aware of the severe impacts faced by individuals who are taken hostage or arbitrarily detained. It is clear that more must be done to support the survivors of such acts and their families and loved ones. We have been active in supporting Canadian citizens and permanent residents who have faced arbitrary detention abroad. This includes well-known cases of Maher Rar, Abdul Al-Maki, Ahmed Abu Al-Mati, and Moya Nuruddin, but also all of whom were detained and tortured in Syrian prisons, as well as Khaled Al-Kazaz, arbitrarily detained by the military government in Egypt, and Abu Sufyan al-Razik, arbitrarily detained and tortured by Sudanese national security forces. More recently, we have advocated for the return of all Canadians arbitrarily detained in northeast Syria, including Canadian women and children in detention camps, and Canadian men being held incommunicado and without charges in life-threatening conditions in prisons. We cannot be clearer that hostage-taking and arbitrary detention violate Canadian and international law, and that Canada must act to address these crimes. While we agree with the intent of the bill to support survivors and their families, we are not certain that this bill is necessary and worry that in fact it could have negative, unintended consequences, both in countering arbitrary detention and more broadly. First, we are overall skeptical of attempts to establish new sanctions regimes in general. There is a growing body of research that the increase in unilateral sanctions regimes has not been effective in protecting rights internationally, and that they can result in wasted resources and have severe unintended consequences on the delivery and provision of international aid. If sanctions are believed to be necessary, they must be narrow and targeted. We believe this is not the case with Bill C-353. It would target not just individuals, but broadly defined foreign entities and entire foreign states, including, according to Section 5.3a, the property of any national within a sanctioned state. This poses a real threat of unintended consequences that could impact humanitarian aid, international assistance, peace building, and even diplomacy. It also means that such sanctions could, if a government wanted to, be used to punish broad swaths of foreign nationals, their governments, and their associations in arbitrary ways. Second, we are concerned about low thresholds in this bill. For example, Section 5.1 allows for the levying of sanctions on the basis that the governor and council is of the opinion that a foreign national, state, or entity is responsible for or complicit in hostage-taking or state-to-state arbitrary detention. These are incredibly broad powers to be granted based solely on opinion. Moreover, Section 7, in allowing the minister to require any person to provide them with any information that is relevant to an order or regulation under 5.1, would permit the minister to go on a fishing expedition for information. There are no provisions for how that information is to be handled or disposed of. Third, the detention of, quote, the definition of arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations will exclude some of the gravest cases of state-sanctioned arbitrary detention. The definition of arbitrary detention in this bill requires that, and I quote, when a person arbitrarily arrests or detains the individual to compel action from or exercise leverage over a foreign government. In all the cases I listed at the beginning, the arbitrary detention was either done with Canada's complicity or for objectives unrelated to Canada, and not to compel action from a foreign government. Beyond the cases I cited above, we can also look, among others, to that of Hussein Shalil, a Canadian citizen and a Uyghur human rights activist originally from China, who has been arbitrarily detained by that government since 2006. Given that China's interest has nothing to do with influencing Canada or another state, but rather punishing human rights activism, we believe this act would not apply. Fourth, the very broad application of sanctions within this legislation, including to anyone who makes available any property to a sanctioned state, entity, or individual working on their behalf, would prohibit the provision of aid. And while Section 6 allows the minister to provide a permit to carry out an activity that would violate an order under this act, the length of time it would take to secure a permit could have severe impacts on the timely delivery of aid and could lead to organizations simply not applying at all. Moreover, it can negatively impact instances where families or employers are negotiating with hostage takers. They may need to act quickly, but would risk violating this order unless they receive a permit. Finally, we agree completely that more must be done to support survivors of these horrendous acts and their families and loved ones. However, we do not believe this support should be tied to a sanctions regime, nor are we convinced that the answer lies in new legislation. We would point instead to the recommendation of this committee's 2018 report on the provision of consular services. There are clearly other levers that are already available to the government to act in this area, if only there is the political will to use them, and we would urge the government and committee to further pursue that path. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McSorley. Last, we go to Ms. Cheryl Saperia, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Secure Canada. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Sorry. And thank you very much to Melissa Landsman for sponsoring this piece of legislation. If all the world is a stage, then terrorism is theater. Horrific violence that is choreographed to terrorize a global audience. Of the vast array of asymmetrical terrorist tactics, hostage-taking is one of the most terrifying and heartbreaking. The wrongful holding of individuals to inflict harm or seek gain is not a new phenomenon. The biblical commandment of do not steal was understood by rabbinic scholars over 2,000 years ago to refer to the prohibition against kidnapping. Hostage-taking is not just about the individual seized and the agony they suffer. In stealing a person, you take their family hostage, and you also take their people and their country hostage. When a Canadian is wrongfully held by a malign state or non-state actor simply for being a Canadian, it is Canada itself which is held hostage, with the incarcerated person essentially acting as a surrogate for our country. We are living in an era in which hostage-taking and arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations constitute a growing threat to individuals, to entire countries, and to the international order. I have noticed that Canada's default position is often that a new legislative idea is unnecessary, that current laws do enough on their own. But bad actors constantly adjust and enhance their practices, and therefore democratic countries must be nimble, creative, bold, and principled in countering evolving threats. And when it comes to hostage-taking specifically, which is a cost-effective weapon used by state and non-state actors to inflict extreme and disproportionate harm, it behooves our lawmakers to explore every possible tool to assist in repatriating these unwilling ambassadors representing us in the dungeons of our adversaries, and to prevent this fate from befalling other Canadians. At its very foundation, Bill C-353 was created to help Canada fulfill its fundamental responsibility to protect its people and to uphold the value of its citizenship. The Australian Senate recently held hearings on the issue of hostage-taking and wrongful detentions, and this very bill, Bill C-353, was discussed and lauded as a template for a similar Australian initiative. Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert was one of the witnesses to testify in Australia. She spent 804 days in the Iranian prison system, having received a 10-year sentence for espionage, denounced as baseless by the Australian government. She was released in a diplomatic deal in 2020, negotiated by the Australian government, which saw Thailand release 3 Iranians convicted of terrorism offences in exchange for her freedom. I want to share with you a message from Dr. Moore-Gilbert, the director of the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance. Quote, "We applaud and congratulate the Government of Canada for taking the initiative in spearheading the 2021 Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. We would note, however, that in spite of Canada's stated aim of leveraging the declaration to push for impactful multilateral efforts at disincentivizing the practice, very little discernible progress has been made towards this particular goal. The proposed Bill C-353 recognizes that difficult decisions must be made to impose genuine costs on non-state actor hostage takers and governments which arbitrarily detain Canadian citizens for diplomatic leverage. By explicitly setting out the tools through which the Canadian government is empowered to punish and deter hostage takers and perpetrators of arbitrary detention, Bill C-353 provides decision makers with a positive mandate to disincentivize the practice from occurring in the future and to achieve a semblance of justice for victims." End quote. I look forward to a fulsome discussion with members of this committee on the need to redouble our government's efforts to protect Canadians. And I encourage you to direct some questions to my esteemed colleague, board member of Secure Canada, Harris Rafiq, who is a British counter-extremism expert. He is here beside me to join today's discussion and situate hostage-taking within the extremism and terrorism framework. Finally, I would like to acknowledge Danny Eisen, co-founder of Secure Canada, who has been at the centre of our organization's work on this file. Secure Canada is an organization dedicated to combating terrorism, extremism, and other national security threats. we fully endorse Bill C-353 as sober, targeted legislation that is consistent with Canada's obligations under international law to take further action domestically to address the threat of hostage-taking and arbitrary detentions in state-to-state relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Saparia. I did misspeak. I apologize for that. Next, we will go to former Ambassador Nolke. Ambassador Nolke, you have 5 minutes for your opening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and honourable members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation to appear before this committee today. And I'd like to give you an idea of the perspective that I'm bringing to the examination of Bill C-353. I'm a retired Canadian diplomat and international law practitioner. My area of past practice and expertise include international peace and security, UN Charter law, the law of armed conflict and atrocity crimes, terrorism and transnational crime, human rights, economic sanctions, disarmament and non-proliferation. Since my retirement, I've published on more effective implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption through the tracking, tracing, seizure and repurposing of assets, and carried out a number of projects for Global Affairs Canada on a consultancy basis. These include framing the mandate of an independent panel of experts to address the issue of arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations in international law, a study on the legal framework in which Canada carries out its consular activities, including in emergency and crisis situations, and a discussion paper on strengthening Canada's operational response capacity in respect of international hostage takings. I believe that's how my name came to the attention of the committee, but I'm not currently employed by Global Affairs, and I'm speaking entirely in my personal capacity. In the interest of maximizing time for questions, let me just give you a brief rundown on my views. Bill C-353 is a well-intentioned effort to address an operationally complex issue and sensitive issue, that of individual Canadians who fall victims, at times tragically, to forces beyond the control of the Canadian government. In practice, however, I believe the bill to be both unnecessary and possibly counterproductive. It seeks to emulate part of the U.S. Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, but without taking into account important differences in the legal, contextual and operational frameworks between the U.S. and Canada. In Canadian law, as confirmed by this committee in its report on Canada's consular services in 2018, issues relating to national and international security and foreign relations fall under the Crown prerogative rather than under control of Parliament. In November 2023, the Federal Court of Appeal summarized this proper exercise of this power as the responsibility of the executive to make decisions on matters of foreign affairs in the context of complex and ever-changing circumstances, taking into account Canada's broader national interests, and hostage-taking clearly falls under that, and as does arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. Bill C-353, while intended to strengthen the government's toolkit in responding to hostage takings and arbitrary detentions, has the effect of legislating in areas of national security and foreign relations. The decision to apply economic sanctions under the bill is correctly left to the Governor and Council, as it is, for example, under the Special Economic Measures Act. However, creating a specific legal framework for the imposition of sanctions in response to hostage takings could exponentially increase domestic pressure on this and future governments to do so in practice. This risks handing hostage takers and foreign states precisely the leverage they want, driving up the stakes for victims by boxing in the government's response. And I agree with previous speakers on that particular issue. In the case of arbitrary detention by foreign states for political purposes, Canada already has the power to impose sanctions, if that is considered useful, namely under Section 4(1.1) of the Special Economic Measures Act. For terrorist hostage takings, financial dealings with listed terrorist groups and their members are already subject to prohibitions under the Criminal Code. In other words, we already have access to the tools that 353 purports to provide. Other concerns with the bill that I would have include it conflates terrorist hostage takings and arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations and criminal kidnappings. That point has already been made. De facto, it mandates the government's response to hostage takings to include permanent residents, in respect of whom Canada has no standing under international law to exercise consular or diplomatic functions. The statutory requirement to extensively share information with families could compromise operational or national security, while I certainly agree with other speakers that we need to do more to deal with families appropriately. The compensation of individual victims from seized state assets is potentially fraught. Canada is currently subject to a complaint on this very issue before the International Court of Justice in respect of the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act. The specific requirement for parliamentary reporting is redundant. This committee and the NSI COP already have broad mandates to review government actions in this field. And I would note that in 2022, the NSI COP made recommendations on how global affairs could strengthen its response to hostage takings. Legislative action was not among those recommendations. In conclusion, there are clearly multiple areas at the operational level in which Canada's response to terrorist hostage takings and arbitrary detention by foreign states could well be strengthened, streamlined, made more coherent, and particularly all better funded. But Bill C-353, however well-intentioned, is not the answer in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nolke. We will now open it to questions from the members, and we start off with MP Chong. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing to talk about a very important issue. Mr. Fowler, I'd like to direct my questions to you. Thank you for appearing in front of our committee. You've got decades of experience within the Government of Canada as a Deputy Minister and as Ambassador. And so I'd like to, the first question I'd like to ask you relates to the second part of the bill, which is really about improving supports for families of people who have been taken hostage. Can you talk a bit about your experience and how the machinery within the department, the machinery between the department and central agencies could have been improved?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. Mr. Chairman, I've been out of the business of government for a long time. I very much would like to get to Mr. Chong's question, although something says that really it should be my wife that is here answering that question, because I was lying in the sand a long way away, and she had to deal with what he's talking about. Perhaps to sum it up, in listening to testimony a couple of days ago before your committee, I heard again and again that things have changed and that the government does this better and they're better organized, and Global Affairs, my old department, is restructured and ready and able to do all this. And maybe that may well be the case. I simply don't know. But it sure wasn't the case 16 years ago. I mean, just to give you one example, Mary was not told that Louis and I were alive for 45 days. The government knew we were alive immediately following our grab, and they regularly had intelligence information suggesting we were alive at different points after that. In terms of who is managing our affair, I have no idea, because both the RCMP and Foreign Affairs insisted that each of them were in charge. The PCO never said anything to anybody, and never focused attention on to what was not happening. We made 2 videos. Louise and my family were not told that the videos were made. Finally, Mary couldn't stand the lack of information and went down to meet with the Secretary General of the UN, who told her that we were alive and seemed to be in relatively good shape. She then came back, him having told her, Ban Ki-moon having told her that there was a video, demanded to see the video. The video then 45 days old. The RCMP said, well, they'd have trouble translating it, but they'd see what they could do. Mary said she didn't need it translated. And they showed her a video. Some weeks later, about 30 days later, she was going to London to see our 4th daughter who lived there and needed a little care and attention. And before she left, she spoke to her interlocutors from the RCMP saying, I'll be away, but get in touch with me if anything comes up. She was having lunch with our High Commissioner in London, who said, you must be really happy to see the most recent video. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. He left, made a phone call home, and a few minutes later, the RCMP called, said, yes, there's another video. She said, I wanted to see it. And they said, well, you'll have to come back to Canada because we can't possibly, it's so sensitive, we can't possibly send it to London, which of course is idiotic. They did then send it, and she could see it. I might, if I could, just read you one little bit that perhaps highlights my concern in this regard. This from the book I wrote. On 23rd February, one of the rare briefings at Foreign Affairs, Mary asked for confirmation of the accuracy of media reports that suggested our captors had made a specific ransom demand. A very senior RCMP officer, in fact, the future commissioner of the RCMP, interrupted, pointed his finger across the table to where she sat, and snapped, as long as I'm in charge of this investigation, not 1 cent will be paid for the release of a couple of high muckety-mucks. At that point, her trust in the management of her case was destroyed, and Louis' wife, Mai, refused to attend future meetings. So no, relations with hostages 16 years ago was not very well managed.
Thank you. I don't have any questions.
Thank you very much. Now we next go to MP Alghabra. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses, not only for being here today, but for all the work that they've done over the years to help families and victims who've been found in very difficult situation. And I'm also humbled by the presence of Mr. Fowler here. Mr. Fowler, I'm grateful for your service, and I'm really delighted that you're here with us safely. Look, I don't subscribe to the idea that our current policies or the execution of our policies as a government has been perfect, nor do I subscribe to the idea that there's no opportunity for additional reforms or introduction of new legislation for that matter. I think there might be a room for additional tools. My concern is that this current proposal doesn't really do what is intended to do. And I question whether it really would help a Canadian citizen or someone who's in a difficult situation, either in arbitrary detention or a hostage taking, and that these new tools would help get them out of harm's way. And I also worry that it raises expectations, unreasonable expectations, to the degree that the government is unable to fulfill, where many Canadian families who have loved ones in a difficult situation may start expecting that the government of Canada uses these new tools at their disposal, but really without an appropriate application for them. So I'm going to start my questions with Ms. Tish. You talked about, I do have concerns about expanding the eligibility for non-Canadian citizens, particularly protected persons. Who decides who is a protected person? I mean, I know the definition of a protected person, and in Canada, we have the IRB that decides whether a claimant is a protected person or not. But someone who finds themselves in a difficult situation abroad and they're not at home, who defines them to be a protected person?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, eligible protected person is essentially someone with refugee status that is not inadmissible under security grounds or on grounds of violating human or international rights or criminality. So it's essentially refugees in Canada with a couple of exceptions. And in terms of who decides, I expect it would be the relevant minister under the Act, although
So sorry, allow me to interrupt just to preserve time, efficiency of time.
Yes.
So are you suggesting that protected persons in this bill are intended for those who have been found by the Canadian IRB as a protected person?
I believe so, yes.
So you're not suggesting, because the bill is not really clear about that. It says protected persons, and it could be a refugee claimant who perhaps made a submission to the United Nations for claimant of refugee. Would that person be eligible for this consular service?
I don't believe so, but I'd actually like to take this question on notice if that's possible and get back to you because I'm not 100% sure, and I don't want to say yes or no if I'm not 100% sure on this.
Yeah, and therein lies the dilemma, right? There are some, and again, I worry about the expectations that this bill would introduce to people around the world that the Canadian government would have a role in their situation. The other question I have, did you want to say something, Ms. Teach?
Yes, I mean, I think just in terms of the expectation point, I think, this is what this process is so good for, right? Is fleshing out the details. And this is the clause by clause in particular. We'll do much more of that next week. And I think in terms of managing expectations, again, I'm not a legislator, but it strikes me that if this bill becomes law, it will be accompanied by probably press release, some backgrounders online, and it would become clear who it applies to. So I think that the managing expectation piece can be tackled, whatever the answers to those questions are.
I think it's much more complicated than that. But the other point that I wanted to raise is we heard Mr. McSorley talk about arbitrary detention, and he used examples of arbitrary detention that I think people will argue, are they arbitrary detention or are they other type of detention? And that's also the challenge that I have with this bill, is that it raises expectations, once again, for any family who has a person who's been unfairly detained in another country, that all of a sudden the Canadian government must utilize these tools. And there's plenty, unfortunately, of Canadians who find themselves sometimes in a difficult situation.
Right. I mean, when it comes to that point about what is arbitrary detention, I think what I'd like to say in response to that is the definition that this bill uses for arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations is drawn word for word from the Multilateral Declaration. And likewise, the definition of hostage taking is drawn from the Criminal Code. So this bill is not meant to capture arbitrary detention. This bill is meant to capture hostage taking and arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations, which is a different term. So you're right, it wouldn't cover everything. It is quite narrowly focused in that way.
But if legislators are unable to make a differentiation, if experts are unable to make that differentiation, so you can imagine a distraught family that has a loved one who is in a difficult situation, how they would feel about the application of this bill. And
That's
I think
fair
I ran
enough.
out of time.
Can I respond just a few seconds to that? I imagine that there were similar concerns with the Multilateral Declaration. That declaration also used the term arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations and not arbitrary detention.
Let's move to Mr. Bergeron. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fowler, I noticed in your opening remarks that you said the following. You said it might not have been the opportune moment for the government to reveal everything they could and wanted to or wanted to have done. In that case, do you not think that regulating everything in legislation would go against the flexibility the Canadian government needs?
Mr. Chair, in response to Mr. Bergeron, I like this bill because it collects the tools that I saw that could have been extremely useful in the situation I found myself in Mali and Niger 16 years ago. All of the elements of this bill would have applied to that situation. That is, the government of Mali could well have been subject to the threat, certainly, of sanctions of some form or another. Individuals could certainly have been encouraged to be cooperative by paying them, and possibly could have been encouraged to be helpful, knowing that they might be received in Canada. All of those I consider to be very useful tools. I'm not a legislative expert, and I didn't mean to suggest that those were the only tools. And I certainly did mean to suggest that there were other tools that I didn't think government should talk about. And I still believe that strongly. So I don't look at this bill as being exclusive. I don't look at this bill as suggesting in any way that that's it, that's enough. It's not. Other things are needed.
Dans une entrevue que vous accordiez.
In an interview with the CBC in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, you said that you were certain that a ransom had been paid by the UN for you to be freed. Many reports suggested that a ransom had been paid. I say very clearly in my book that Prime Minister Harper said directly that Canada paid no ransom and that Canada had not freed any prisoners, or not seen any prisoners freed, rather. I added something like, I have no reason to not believe Prime Minister Harper. That said, I'm here in front of you not because of my pretty eyes. I'm here probably because my kidnappers decapitated a British hostage 6 weeks after he and I were freed. 6 weeks later, the British colleague was freed. I speak of two distinct people here. I think this might have been the scenario for me if we had not been freed. So, was a ransom paid? Yes. Or if so, by whom? I wouldn't know. There are many possibilities, and I'm pleased to say that I don't know the answer. In your opinion, in some cases, could Canada have allowed other countries to pay a ransom for their own citizens? Well, yes, in theory, but in reality, I don't know.
Organisation?
For some other organization, I have no idea. But I do know that if it wasn't the case, then I would be dead. That is clear. So I would add the following. I think that a government's first priority, or first responsibility rather, is to protect its citizens. with regards to the situation in the Philippines that I mentioned, which included Mr. Risdale and Hall, well, they are dead. And the Norwegian is not. I think few countries have a better reputation than Norway does. They do what they say, and they are a reasonable, respectable, and generous country that is involved with their citizens.
Go to MP McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all of the witnesses today for all of their testimony. It's been very interesting and informative. So I deeply appreciate that. I'm going to start by asking Mr. McSorley some questions about arbitrary detention. You in your testimony, you actually talked about Hussein Jalil. You talked about those coming from Northeast Syria. I want to get a little bit of a sense from your perspective, because on Tuesday, I asked MP Landsman if she believed that this bill would apply to Canadians, and she confirmed that she believed that it would. However, given your testimony and given your experience advocating for Canadians in complicated cases, I would like to know your thoughts on it. How have you assessed the bill in this regard? I think you've mentioned it a little bit, but could it assist Canadians arbitrarily detained and their families? Or does this still remain a challenge, particularly in cases where the Canadian government of the day does not have either the political will or the interest in pushing for resolutions to these cases?
Thank you, through the chair, very much for that question. So in fact, yes, I noted that at the last meeting that that MP Landsman believed that this bill would apply to the cases of people like Maher Arar. Earlier, in fact, I think I agree more with Ms. Teach's interpretation that the definition of state-to-state arbitrary detention, this bill would not apply to his particular case. And there can be an argument made about whether or not this bill is intended to be broad or narrow in focus. But we believe that if we're going to seriously be tackling issues of arbitrary detention internationally, that these types of cases need to be included. And I take MP Algabra's question about, would this apply then to, should we be just, addressing every case where we believe it's an individual believes it's an unfair detention? But if I can take the case of Canadians in Northeast Syria, they are being detained indefinitely without charges. I can't think of a different definition of what would be considered arbitrary detention than cases where people are being detained without charges, with no access to justice. And so the fact that they're being held in such a way, not in order to influence the Canadian government, but because of unfounded accusations that have not led to legal charges, they would be excluded from this bill. And so I believe, that it wasn't the intention of this bill to capture necessarily those kinds of cases, but that if we are to want to tackle these kinds of issues internationally, then these types of cases must be included in these discussions, and ideally in any overall policy approach, whether it's legislation or whether it's modifying consular services or new policies like Global Affairs Canada.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I would like to talk a little bit about how we could improve this bill, I guess. So we know that Bill C-353 outlines sanctions against those who engage in arbitrary detention. How this will be operationalized for cases where the Canadian government has been unable, or as we see in Syria, unwilling to take action on behalf of Canadian citizens in a timely manner. What additional measures do you recommend could be added to this bill to ensure that Canada has a more robust, consistent approach to supporting these individuals in these complex cases? I mean, MP Landsman said very clearly that there was a lot of discretion, ministerial discretion within this bill. What are some of the things that we could do to actually ensure that it is robust and consistent?
Well, I think, first of all, including that the definition of arbitrary detention would include those individuals. I think going back to the 2018 report on consular services from this committee, there's questions around how consular services approaches allegations of those being detained of torture and mistreatment and the turnaround time. and that action and policy be put in place to ensure that each case is treated fairly and independently and without bias. So I think looking towards that, maybe not all those things would actually be able to fit in this kinds of legislation, but I think those are the kinds of solutions we would need to be looking at.
Wonderful, thank you. You know, many of the crimes this bill targets, such as violations of sanctions and human rights abuses, are already covered under Canada's criminal code and international legal framework. So obviously for many, the concern is that these crimes are not being prioritized by the RCMP and other enforcement agencies because they don't necessarily have the resources to do that work. This has led to a situation where people who violate sanctions or engage in human rights violations largely or often go uninvestigated and unprosecuted. How should Canada ensure that existing crimes, including those related to sanction violations, are prioritized and that there are concrete measures in place to make sure that these crimes are actually investigated and prosecuted? Do you think there's room in this bill to address that?
I'm not sure what could be changed in this bill to more appropriately address that. I do think it is a resources question. I think that it would take better resourcing for the RCMP and other government bodies to be able to conduct complex international investigations to gather evidence in order to bring charges against individuals who engage in arbitrary detention or hostage taking internationally. And we've seen that in the past, the RCMP has laid charges in complex cases, even of individuals that they don't really have a prospect of arresting and bringing to Canada. One other thing I would point to, though, as well, is that in that same report from 2018, there was a suggestion to actually amend Canada's anti-terrorism laws to ensure that the provision of support to be able to free hostage takers wouldn't violate, who are taken by a terrorist entity, would not violate Canada's counter-terrorist financing or counter-terrorism laws, and that hasn't happened. So that's another area that we could be looking at.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To MP Chong, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Mr. Fowler again another question, and I'd like to frame the question first. You mentioned in your opening remarks that there are 2 broad approaches that governments have taken to hostage taking. One is an immutable position, and then the other is one that provides some creativity and flexibility, if I recall correctly. And I want to explore that a little bit. It seems to me that there's 2 schools of thought on hostage taking. One is that you don't negotiate with hostage takers, you don't pay ransom, you don't, do anything, because the argument goes that you would be providing incentives for more of the same. I've read other arguments from people who have done research in this field that argue the opposite, who said there's no evidence that taking the first immutable position actually reduces the incidences of hostage taking, and some have even argued quite the opposite, that what happened in the Philippines that you referenced earlier actually leads to more incentives because it was broadcast, as you said, on social media around the world millions of times. So can you maybe advise this committee your view on what the evidence points to and what the better approach is when it comes to governments managing hostage taking and providing incentives and disincentives with respect to hostage taking? Because Part 1 of the bill really is about a punishment regime that transfers the onus from the families of hostage takers, which is what you really have a situation when there is an immutable set of principles that the government doesn't do anything, to one where the government has an obligation to punish hostage takers, which shifts that burden from families to the state. And I'd like you to maybe talk a bit about that.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, it's a great question. I'm of the firm belief that the absolute maximum flexibility should be afforded to the people who have to deal with the hostage crisis. I'm not, therefore, in favor of broad, firm, clear, immutable constraints on what they can and can't do. I have little time, you will have heard, for those who invoke great principles and then break them. The last thing I think anybody would want to see is ransom or us type provisions in any kind of legislation. And I certainly would never be light about whether some kind, I stress, some kind of ransom or quid pro quo for getting a Canadian out of such circumstances might be in order. There are lots of ways of doing that, and I wouldn't want to see them prescribed. And I guess what I was saying earlier is everybody blinks. By that, I mean the most firm, stern, immutable insisters on never negotiate, never make a significant concession, do so when they have to, and don't when they don't have to. Therefore, I would not wish to see Canadian negotiators wrapped into constraining, binding principle that would diminish their ability to get the job done.
Thank you.
Thank you. We next go to MP Oliphant. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I am finding the testimony quite helpful in 2 ways. It reminds us of the importance of first-person narrative and the understanding of people who have experienced this. Mr. Fowler, I've read your book, Seasonal Hell. I read it when I was doing consular affairs. As a parliamentary secretary, it was helpful to me to have that. But I also have heard the problems of this bill. And for me, I believe they're insurmountable. And I believe they do exactly what you don't want to have done, which is constrain and confine and take away the fact that this work is more art than science. And I believe that our diplomats are well trained. They're not perfect. And our consular affairs officials are well trained and sensitive, not perfect. However, you're alive, and we're glad you're here. And we've had more success stories than we've had failures. Doesn't mean you won't have failures. But I want to turn to Ms. Simons. I said Simons. Simons or Simmons? Either or. I would say Simons. You're very helpful for me in understanding the various categories of people that seem to get lumped into this bill that become problematic for me, and the differences between hostages who have been taken by criminal organizations or criminals, hostages taken by terrorists, kidnapping, which may be somewhat different from that, arbitrary detention, and arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. I mean, there's at least 5 or 6 categories that I think all demand a different set of tools because they have different motivations. What would be helpful for me is, and I won't support this bill. I will want to send it back with a negative a recommendation for the House. But that doesn't mean I don't think we can improve the work we do. Partly resources, partly, and I don't think it's a legislative fix. I think that there are some things we could do. Are there a few things that you think, even from a distance, and you recognize Canada is a leader in this, and plus our arbitrary detention initiative, which is to say we try to do this together with like-minded countries. Are there some things you might say we could recommend to the government that could be helpful to honor and validate the experience of Mr. Fowler, but also not put Canadians at risk in the future because we're the soft touch for hostages?
Thank you very much for your question. It's a slightly difficult one to answer because I think you've asked me about the arbitrary detentions and hostage takings both, and I think the answer would be slightly different. Where arbitrary arbitrary detentions are concerned, it would be helpful for families to have greater clarity about whether their case is an arbitrary detention. And I think one thing that has been done south of the border that has been helpful is the Levinson Act criteria, which sets out what constitutes a wrongful detention in American terminology. What's also been helpful there, and this, let's face it, the United States did not have a good record in hostage-taking resolution before 2013, 14, well, before 2015, I should say. And indeed, they're still probably not doing terribly well in bringing home hostages who are taken by terrorists, and they're a target for that. But actually, the Five Eyes, and I think Robert Fowler was alluding to this, the Five Eyes partners also have a poor record, and that's probably because of the policy on no concessions to terrorists. And I'm not advocating that that should change, but that is a fact, and we have to recognise that. It does mean other tools would, should be looked at, and as you've said, and I've agreed, those tools that are in this legislation, I don't think are the right ones. But accountability of the government to the families and like
Ms. Simmons, if I could ask that you wrap it up within 20 seconds, please.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask if Ms. Simons has something she'd like to send in writing that may be helpful, and we would very much appreciate it, because I have a feeling I asked a complex question and gave her no time to answer it, so that might be helpful.
Absolutely, Ms. Simmons. You have another 20 seconds, but if there's any further elaboration, please do feel free to send us written submissions. And that obviously applies to anyone who is here as a witness. I apologize for the interruption. You have another 20 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's Ms. Simons. What is useful is changing the framework and giving someone accountability in government to the families who actually understands these cases. That is what is missing at the moment, is someone who is in government who has longevity in their role and has experience about hostage-taking and arbitrary detentions and is able to explain those cases to the family and do what they need to do with flexibility to resolve them and bring the hostages and detainees home. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. We next go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to continue on my previous questions. I'm sorry to all of the witnesses for not having more time for you. There's just a lot of you, and we would love to be able to ask you more questions. I'd like to continue my discussion and exchange with Mr. Fowler. Montesquieu said, I don't think that it is wise for the government of Canada to say that they will or won't pay a ransom. It could put a cost on the head of Canadians that are abroad. A citizen abroad should know that Canada would be willing to pay a ransom in order to secure their freedom. But then you've said a number of things, and some of the things in this bill worry me because, as you've said, it's not very clear. It's said very explicitly in the bill what the government of Canada could or should do and what the impacts might be. Do you not agree with that? Yes.
I would recommend that any legislation, any public statement by any Canadian government, politician or official remain utterly silent on the matter of ransom. In all circumstances, anywhere. It provides greater flexibility. You did raise something that I wanted to get back to, which was, and I've heard that raised in various situations, and I think Mr. Oliphant mentioned it a moment ago. I think the hostage taking of Canadians because they're Canadian has been extremely rare. the Canadians who have been hostages were largely in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were rich, they were from a rich country, they were from a Western country, and they were available. And they were taken. I honestly see very little that we would be doing that would then paste a sign on Canadians around the world saying, I'm a Canadian, take me. That would be very unlikely in my view, and I see the chair is waving at me, so I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Fowler. So next we go to MP McPherson. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think I'm going to ask some questions actually of Ambassador Nolte, if I could. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. We know that you've got a strong career representing Canada, particularly with regards to international law and international human rights. And as someone with experience advising the Canadian government on these matters, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the challenges Canada faces in
responding. MP McPherson, evidently there's some sound problems we're experiencing on our end. Can you make sure?
Plug in, plug back in.
Thank you.
Can you? Oh. Is that better? Do you want?
That is better, right? If you could keep speaking. Sorry.
Sure. So these were. Did you hear anything I said, Mr. Chair, or should I start from the beginning?
I hear you, but it's not muffled for anyone, is it? It's good? Okay, yes, proceed.
Maybe it's me that's muffled, not my sound, Mr. Chair. I wouldn't. I will try to be more articulate. So again, I'd like to hear the thoughts that the challenges that Canada would face in responding to cases of arbitrary detention abroad, what measures Canada could do to adopt more effectively steps that would support Canadians that are arbitrarily detained. So first of all, how does Canada currently balance diplomatic and trade priorities with the urgency of protecting Canadian citizens in these complex cases? And where should Canada be exerting more pressure? Do you think Bill C-353 offers the minister more flexibility, too much flexibility? How do you assess that in addressing these particular concerns?
Okay. Thank you for that question. It's a very complex one. I hope I have enough time to answer it. I don't think the bill offers the minister anything that he or she doesn't already have. If it comes to cases of arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations, those are matters of international peace and security because it amounts to diplomatic coercion, and that's where the security aspects comes in. So if a minister were to decide that economic sanctions are the answer, they can already apply those under the Special Economic Measures Act. Frankly, in the diplomatic coercion scenario, the best response is one where Canada does not stand alone. So the current initiative on arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations is not the answer. It is an incremental step towards an answer. The government has created this international panel of experts that is going to hopefully make recommendations as to how state recourse can be more formalized. What can states do to actually respond comprehensively and meaningfully to another state seeking to coerce it into action through threats to its nationals? So the tools are not legislative tools. The tools are diplomatic tools. And they are multilateral tools because, frankly, and I think it was Ambassador Fowler has already said that, if Canada stands and says something and does something, it doesn't mean very much in the great scheme of things. Economic sanctions unilaterally imposed by Canada alone are not going to be effective. The solution has to be broader.
Thank you, Ambassador Nolte.
That might be my time.
Yes, it was over. We next go to MP Epp. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you for all the excellent testimony here from all the witnesses. My understanding of 353 is that it provides options or tools in the tool chest. There's nothing really mandatory about the bill. And so I'd like to begin with actually what I heard as conflicting potential results from adding more tools to the tool chest. So Ms. Teach, in an article you wrote this summer, you quoted a British barrister, Amal Clooney, in saying that there seems to be reluctance from many of the Five Eyes countries for using the existing tools that are there and are therefore supporting 353 and the additional tools, particular around targeted sanctioning for sanctioning around hostage taking, and also the potential for monetary or PR status, etc. And yet, Ms. Nolke, if I understood your testimony, that you are concerned that the existence of more tools and more publicity around those tools might put undue pressure, if I understood your testimony correctly, undue pressure on governments to act without discretion or without, that's probably stated too strongly, but that they would have a more difficult time resisting public pressure. And so I would ask each of you to comment on that dynamic. Implicit in that is, the quality of intelligence from our intelligence community and the ability to make good decisions where there's flexibility, where there's no mandatory nature of additional tools. Maybe we'll start with Ms. Teach.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And yes, I quoted from Barrister Amal Clooney, and she found as part of a large study that there was an apparent reticence, was the words she used, to impose targeted sanctions. She did a study looking at the UK, Canada, the US, the EU, I believe, and found that particularly in cases of arbitrary detention of journalists, that targeted sanctions were not used in response using Magnitsky Acts and other current tools. And this is why this bill, in my opinion, is so important, because it provides, without mandatory anything related to sanctions, it provides a very clear direction that targeted sanctions are something that can be used for this purpose.
Thank you. Ms. Nolke.
That would be, if that tool is available, it would be subject to debate in Parliament. The first thing you will hear is we have this legislation, why aren't we using it? Which will then raise the political pressure to act in a certain way. That is the concern, because it increases the currency of the hostages. Once a hostage taker knows that the victim really is now the subject of sustained domestic political pressure, the hostage becomes more valuable, and the resolution will become more expensive. That's the concern. When it comes to choosing sanctions as a response, that choice is already available under the Special Economic Measures Act. But if you put a specific name to this particular tool, I would suggest that it risks making the pressure to use that tool greater, and that in return increases the political value of the hostage. That would be my concern.
I could perhaps understand that while the legislation is being debated through Parliament, but once that's in place, do you think that perception in the hostage-taking community, if there is such a thing, would be sustained? I mean, it would be a tool. It would be, yes, for hostage-taking, but again, it would boil back to the ability of our intelligence community to make recommendations to the government, that would be whether to enact on a tool or not. Public pressure, public pressure at times isn't a bad thing on a government. Now, pushback.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd probably be the first one to agree with that. Absolutely, yes. In this particular case, though, elevating a hostage crisis to a political debate would be counterproductive in my view.
Thank you. Next, we go to Mr. Zuberi. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here, both on Zoom and in person. Mr. Fowler, it's good to hear from you and see you in person. I'm so happy that you and your family had a positive end to your ordeal. And I want to start off my questioning with Ms. Simmons. Essentially, I want to ask about Canadian money and it getting the hands of criminals and terrorists through this legislation. Do you think that that would be the case if this bill became law? Would money end up in the hands of criminals and terrorists through this? Or could it end up in the hands of them?
Yes, thank you for the question. it could indeed. There's plenty of evidence out there that when there's a kidnapping, whether it's a criminal group or a terrorist group, that there are plenty of individuals who want to take advantage of it to make some money themselves. And we've seen many cases over the years of third-party individuals coming forward and offering information and cooperation, and asking to be paid for it or to be given some concession. And many times, most of the times, the vast majority of times, that information is not good information, and those people who are involved in sharing the information are in cahoots with the people who are carrying out the hostage taking. So I would be concerned that money would be going to individuals who are complicit in hostage taking if third-party individuals are incentivized.
Let's take this, and I'm being heckled, Mr. Speaker, by a member from the Conservative Party in the middle of this testimony. It's a bit unusual. But let's take this and take it further. So a listed terror organization in Canada, we now, as you said, might end up paying them. How do we square this circle when we actually aren't supposed to be subsidizing listed terrorist groups here at all, but this legislation provides the possibility for that to happen? How do we square that circle?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know how you square that circle, but it's hypocritical, I guess, because families aren't allowed to pay ransoms to terrorist groups. But if government is, that doesn't come across very well. So yeah, I'm not sure how you can actually square it.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Ms. Nolke, Ambassador Nolke. With respect to victims and their families and those who have been taken hostage, arbitrarily detained, etc., to your knowledge, were there ever instances when people, families, individuals wanted their privacy to be respected in a way that their story does not get out into the public?
There have certainly been cases, I think the CBC reporter Melissa Fung, for example, this was a case where information was very hardly clamped down on, and it did not get released until after she was released. So yes, there are certainly circumstances where secrecy will assist the resolution effort.
The current this legislation says that the minister must make a summary of reports. How would those two things contradict each other?
The concerns that I have is not that information gets transmitted to the families. I think the families, and Ambassador Fowler is quite correct, the families need to be informed as to what's going on. However, when you're dealing particularly with terrorist kidnapping cases, terrorist hostage cases, there may be, there's intelligence involved. The families are not necessarily cleared to receive that information, and they might be under stress, and information that could be prejudicial could be released. So there's a delicacy there, making mandatory information exchanges. There has to be discretion in there.
Thank you. We next go to MP Hoback. You have 4 minutes.
I want to thank all the witnesses for being here, for sure, this afternoon. It's such a serious issue. And, I guess we want to make sure that we do have all the toolbox rapidly available at disposals to our consular people so that they can make the appropriate decisions and get the action. I'm just kind of curious, for example, it's kind of viewed this as a Crime Stoppers type of legislation in some ways. So you're providing the ability to pay informants, to pay people that give you data, provide maybe even if they're in positions of being threatened themselves, if they provide you with that data to offer residency. Where is that existing right now within the government, Ms. Nolke? Like, is that a way that could you do that tomorrow if that was the scenario that you needed to do?
I don't think we can do it right now. Mm-hmm. Whether it's advisable to do it is a different question.
Again, that advisability would depend on the scenario, correct?
Yeah.
So it depends on the situation. The counselor or the person looking at all the facts would decide and say, in this situation, the information is so valuable, the person is extended the, the possibility of losing their own life if they stay within that country or that region.
Yeah.
So wouldn't they be better off to be able to make that decision instead of trying to go back to the bureaucracy that would go through 30 different steps before you'd actually make a decision?
Yeah, I'm aware of cases where we have brought witnesses in complex criminal investigations and transnational organized crime scenarios
But the process to do that
Canada.
right now would
Yes.
probably not happen within 2 weeks, would it?
No, not necessarily. No, I
Would
would
it
doubt
happen in
that.
6 weeks?
I can't give you a time estimate.
So you
but
can see why the importance of
Yes.
legislation in this scenario to give that flexibility, because time is of the essence. Would you not agree?
Yeah, the problem is that you need to know your customer. And I think Ms. Simons has already alerted to that fact. We might end up financing a terrorist organization by supporting an individual
Let's
who,
take a step
who
back
is
there, because it's very
assisted.
clear in the testimony we had last week or last day, Ms. Lasman, that gave that this would not go to terrorist organizations. This is like Crime Stoppers. This is going to the whistleblower. This is going to the person that's actually aiding us. No terrorist organization is going to do that. So the ability for it to actually be cross-referenced into that type, I think, is unfair. Mr. Rafiq, you were kind of shaking your hands. How do you see this working out, in your opinion?
Thank you to the committee for inviting me here. I want to say this with as much humility as possible. I want to say this as one of the world's top 10 experts recognized in counterterrorism in the Western world. I want to say this as the author of the Countering Violence Extremism strategy that the US has adopted, originally the PVE strategy in the UK. I want to say this as advisor to 4.5 British Prime Ministers. I say half because one of them didn't last very long. Bipartisan. I want to say this as the former advisor to the head of counterterrorism in Europol, Gilles de Kerchove. I want to say this as somebody who has not been directly involved in Mr. Fowler's case, but he was in my orbit and my team's orbit. I want to say that if my team, who have been involved, and I've been doing this for over 20 years now, on the ground, at policy, if we'd have had these tools, we'd have saved more lives. If we'd have had these tools, we would have been able to disrupt potential terrorist financing in the UK. If we'd have had these tools, we would have been able to not only save lives, but be proactive. It doesn't mean that every single tool in the toolkit would have been used for every single case. That's why I was shaking my head.
I come back to, it's up to the person at that point in time who's making decisions to decide which tool to use in that occasion.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for your time. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We next go to back to MPL Gabra. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, I want to once again thank the witnesses. It's been really an interesting conversation. And I want to direct my questions to Ms. Nolke and build on what MP Epp has been asking about the pressure, the political pressure. And his point is that maybe, once the debate of this bill dies down, that it will no longer become a political football. I actually respectfully disagree, because if I had a family member or a loved one who found themselves in a difficult situation, the first thing I would demand that my government applies these tools, regardless of my ability to understand the complexity of the situation. I am emotionally vested, and I want the government to quickly use these tools and impose sanctions, even though it may not be advisable in this situation. So, Ms. Nolke, can you comment on that?
I think, Mr. Algabra, you've said exactly what I wanted to say. It's having the visible availability of these sanctions will increase the pressure to use them. We've seen that in other contexts where there's been pressure to impose sanctions in particular situations, and they've been actually pretty ineffective. It's one of those tools that can be politically useful, practically not so much.
And the other part of the unreasonable expectation is that every Canadian family member who has a loved one in an arbitrary detention Now, whether it fits the arbitrary detention state-to-state relation or it doesn't, they still feel that the government must apply these tools immediately. So you can only imagine either whether the law was explicit or not, the type of pressure and expectation that sometimes is unreasonable that those family members, those Canadian citizens will have, that the government enact these tools immediately in a potentially counterproductive way.
I would agree with that assessment, yes.
So if there's an agreement that government has these tools already on the book, but they're not explicitly put the way this bill does, then why do we need this bill? And the only thing I think this bill does is increase expectations, unreasonable expectations, cause perhaps more heartache to family members who feel that the government is not using all the necessary tools, even though the government is, but it's being guided by intelligence and information that they have. So I really think this bill might end up, instead of solving a problem, causing additional heartache for Canadians who have loved ones in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, and that's why in my conclusion I said the answer is probably not the legislative answer. The answer to strengthening our ability to respond to these incidents will be operational and resource-based. We need to break down silos that exist between departments. We need to streamline our response capability. Ms. Simmons' suggestion that we have a dedicated official who does nothing but deal with hostage cases is an absolutely valid one. I very strongly support that. So the responses would be better operational and resource-based than legislative.
Thank you. So for our last two questions, we go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Ms. Superior a question. Your organization seems to be committed in the fight against terrorism, if I've understood correctly. I'd like to give you an example of a prisoner exchange with Iran, which gave way to the freeing of 3 terrorists. If I've understood it correctly, you welcomed the liberation of those prisoners, and would that not go against the principles of your organization, which I think tries to, remove the most many terrorists from circulation, if you will?
Thank you very much for the question. The reference that I made was to Kylie Moore Gilbert, who was in Australia, who was released following that trade. What she was saying is that Australia did not have this bill, that she wished that those tools were available in Australia, and what ultimately ended up happening to lead to her release was the exchange of 3 convicted terrorists. So her point was that she wished Australia had the legislative tools that were being proposed in Bill C-353. From my perspective, I do believe that there is a significant difference between money going to the organizers of a hostage taking as a ransom versus money going to peel off a bad guy who can be wooed, incentivized to walk away from his terrorist activity and to start a new life, or where the incentivization could go towards, and of course I'm being facetious here, but going to the janitor who's not involved but might have intimate information of the case that might be able to actually secure the release of a human being. And to my mind, that is worth exploring every possible tool. So none of this is mandatory.
Time.
This is discretionary.
Thank you, Ms. Superior. For our last question, we go to MP McPherson. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think I kind of want to follow a little bit on that last comment that it is all discretionary. And I'm going to ask you, Mr. McSorley, again, if I could. One of the concerns that I have with this legislation is that we've heard from other witnesses, we've heard from other members of parliament that there is some potential for political abuse, particularly due to the broad language that could allow for sanctions against individuals, entities, or even entire foreign states. We know that the bill has a low threshold for ministerial discretion, specifically the in their opinion standard. This raises concerns because many times New Democrats have raised the issues where the government is not standing up for Canadians around the world, is not doing enough, and is making decisions that are political rather than using just adequate legal safeguards. So how would you view the effectiveness of broadly applied sanctions in achieving their intended outcomes? And what are the improvements or safeguards that you would suggest to ensure that these sanctions are narrowly focused, that they're based on clear evidence, that they're subject to proper judicial oversight, rather than just subjective political opinion?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I'd reiterate what I said earlier about how there's a growing body of research and studies that questions whether or not unilateral sanctions are effective. If in this case we were to look at potential ways to improve this legislation, it's modeled in large part on Canada's Magnitsky Law, and in that case it's targeted towards specifically to individuals. So if we are going to be looking at sanctions, having targeted sanctions that go that are in regards to specific individuals and not entire entities or entire states or entire governments would allow some form of protection, although we're still fairly critical of that. Beyond that, as I raised, there's a concern that, and as you said, that these sanctions can be levied if the Governor and Council is of the opinion. We would believe that to improve that, some form of judicial safeguard could be put in place, so that it would have to be reviewed judicially within a certain amount of time if it's not, pre-authorized by a judge. But of course, that also runs into the question that's been raised about the discretion of government and ministers in these types of cases. And so it does kind of raise the question of whether or not there would be a conflict there between judicial authorization and ministerial discretion to act on these issues. So I think all those points make it incredibly difficult to find clear ways to amend this legislation so that it would be workable to achieve its goals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions. Allow me to thank you all for your very informative and for all your rich perspectives on these challenging questions. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Chair, please allow me to table a motion. Given that during the 44th Parliament since November 21st, 2021, or October 21st, I believe, the Minister of Foreign Affairs has appeared only once before the members of this committee in connection with the study of government estimates, and that she has appeared only 4 times since the beginning of this Parliament.
I want to check on, has notice for the motion been given to the committee?
Je le fais là.
But we're not in a business meeting, so you're...
It is notice of the motion.
Okay, thank you.
Que depuis sa nomination...
That since his appointment on July 26, 2023, the Minister of International Development has testified only once before the Foreign Affairs Committee. The members of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development expresses their disappointment, their deep disappointment, that the ministers ignore the invitations sent by the committee, in particular those concerning the study of their department's credits, and that this be reported to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Ambassador Nolke, Ambassador Fowler, Ms. Saperia, Mr. Rafiq, Ms. Simons, Ms. Teach, and Mr. McSorley. Thank you very, very much for your time. Very grateful indeed. Meeting stands adjourned.